The wind howled across the barren plains of Centauri 7, lifting ash and frost into swirling ghosts that danced between the remnants of what had once been a thriving research colony. Now, it was nothing more than twisted steel skeletons and half-buried domes, scared by war and abandonment. Towering shadows from long-dead satellites flickered in the overcast sky, barely visible through the heavy clouds that never seemed to break. Orion Vale adjusted the straps of his weather-worn pack and trudged forward, boots crunching over shattered solar panels and cracked tiles. He had been walking for hours, searching for anything. Anything useful, anything salvageable, anything left behind. The cold bit at his skin, even through layers of patched-together thermal gear. His breath formed plumes in the air, vanishing as quickly as they appeared. He was alone. That wasn't new. Humanity had once believed Centauri 7 could be the answer to overpopulation and resource shortages. But when contact was lost during the invasion, only silence remained. Rumors had spread that the planet had been overrun by something alien, something brutal. Most had abandoned the thought of returning, but Orion, like many survivors, didn't have the luxury of staying away. The frontier was dangerous, yes, but it was also one of the last places where old tech and clean water could still be found. Today felt different. The quiet wasn't the same. As he passed the remnants of a command outpost, his attention was drawn to a flicker of movement in the corner of his vision. He spun, hand instinctively on the grip of the plasma cutter holstered at his belt. But there was nothing. Only the endless dance of snowflakes and debris. He waited, breath held, heart pounding, until the stillness returned. Then he heard it. A faint sound. A cough. Maybe. Soft. Fragile. It was coming from behind a collapsed communications array nearby. Slowly, cautiously, Orion stepped closer. He moved around the rubble with practiced silence, his fingers lightly brushing the cold edge of his weapon. And then he saw her. A figure was huddled in the shadow of the wreckage, knees drawn to her chest, head bowed. She was clearly not human. Her skin was a muted shade of cobalt blue, speckled with faint bioluminescent freckles that blinked weakly like dying stars. Her hair, if it could be called that, was a cascade of silver threads that shimmered faintly even in the dim light. Her body was trembling, and her thin frame was wrapped in torn fabric that might have once been a uniform or some kind of ceremonial robe. Orion froze. He had never seen one of them up close before. The Eliari. At least that's what the reports had called them. A race of alien beings with psychic abilities and advanced biotech. Some said they were the ones responsible for the invasion. Others said they had tried to stop it. No one really knew. But this one, she wasn't a threat. Not in this state. She looked up, eyes wide and glassy. They were the color of frozen lavender, bright and full of something Orion couldn't immediately name. Desperation. Maybe fear. Maybe something deeper. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her throat was too dry, her body too weak. Orion felt a tension inside him that he hadn't noticed before. He reached into his pack and pulled out one of his last ration bars. It wasn't much compressed nutrients and tasteless carbs, but it was enough to keep someone alive for another day. Without a word, he held it out to her. She didn't move at first, just stared. Then, slowly, with shaking hands, she reached out and took the bar from his fingers. As soon as it touched her palm, she began to cry. Not loudly, not with sobs, but with silent tears that streaked down her dirt-covered cheeks. She clutched the food to her chest for a moment, then tore it open and began to eat, her hands trembling with every motion. Orion crouched beside her, still on edge, still unsure. But something inside him had shifted. This wasn't a chance encounter. It felt like the beginning of something. He could feel it. After a few minutes, she stopped eating and glanced at him. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, as if she'd remembered something important. Then, for the first time, she spoke. Not in words, not with her mouth. A whisper brushed the edge of Orion's mind. A voice, clear and soft, and full of sorrow. "Thank you." Orion blinked. His breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected that. He wasn't sure what to expect next. She reached out again, not for food this time, but gently, cautiously, like someone trying to touch a memory. Her fingers grazed the edge of his glove. Orion didn't pull away. "Who are you?" he finally asked. She shook her head slowly. Her lips moved this time, forming alien syllables too soft to hear. Then her voice echoed again in his mind, clearer this time. "I don't remember." Orion felt a strange ache in his chest. She had no name, no home, no safety, just hunger, pain, and exhaustion. Yet something inside her had survived, a will to keep going. Maybe that's what resonated with him most. He understood that feeling too well. "I'm Orion," he said quietly. "You can come with me. I got shelter. Supplies. Not much, but it's better than this." She didn't answer right away, but her head tilted, and her expression softened. For a moment, the wind seemed to still. And then she nodded. Together, they stood. One human scavenger and one broken alien soul. In a world where everything had fallen apart, their paths had crossed for a reason neither of them yet understood. But the stars were watching. And their story had only just begun. The sky above them stretched endlessly, a canvas of swirling gray clouds tinged with electric blue veins of distant lightning. The air was sharp, almost metallic, as if the planet itself was holding its breath. Centaurus 7 had always been unpredictable, but lately, the weather had grown more violent, like it too mourned something long lost. Orion moved carefully over the cracked pathway leading out of the ruins. The strange woman, this blue-skinned alien with shimmering silver hair, walked beside him, barefoot and silent. She leaned slightly into him for support, though she never made a sound. Her steps were slow, deliberate. Every few minutes her legs would falter, and Orion would reach out instinctively, steadying her before she collapsed again. They didn't speak, not with words, but every now and then, he'd feel a flicker in the back of his mind, a quiet pulse of emotion that wasn't his own. Hunger, pain, gratitude, sorrow. She communicated in bursts of feeling, not full thoughts. And somehow, it made everything more real. The shelter wasn't much, just a dugout chamber beneath a collapsed terradome, lined with scavenged insulation and powered by a single half-functional solar core. But compared to the open cold of the wasteland, it was paradise. Orion ducked inside and helped her lower herself onto the mat of thermoplastic sheets. She curled up without a word, her body trembling, not just from cold but from sheer exhaustion. Orion set a pot of water on the heat pad and added a protein ration to it, soup, of a sort. Not tasty, but warm. As it warmed, he sat across from her, finally taking a moment to study her face. There were faint markings along her jawline, like veins of silver etched into her skin. Her eyes were half closed now, but the intensity in them lingered. They were haunting. Not just alien, but ancient, like she had seen things beyond what humans could imagine. "You've been here long," he muttered, more to himself than her. Too long to still be alive without help. Her eyes fluttered open. A flicker of emotion passed between them. Confusion, then recognition, as if his words had shaken something loose in her memory. He handed her the steaming bowl, and she drank slowly, carefully, her hands wrapped tightly around the heat. Her voice reached him again, not spoken, but in his mind. I flood. They were coming. They tore apart the sky. Orion's jaw tensed. He remembered the stories. Ships like shadows, cutting through the atmosphere. Whole colonies vanishing in seconds. There had been whispers of a second alien faction. Something darker, something cruel. If she had been running from them. "You're not one of them," he said softly. "The ones that attacked us. You're different." She hesitated, then nodded once. Her lips parted, and this time she forced out actual words. "They were broken. gravelly from disuse. "Kaliri," she said, hand lightly touching her chest. "My name." It came out strange, foreign, but beautiful, like a song remembered only in dreams. "Kaliri," Orion repeated. "I'm Orion Vale. Human. Scavenger. Survivor, I guess." She tilted her head slightly, watching him. Another flicker of thought brushed his mind. "You helped. Why?" He gave a tired smile and glanced toward the roof of the shelter where frost had begun to creep along the edges. "Because I know what it's like. To be starving. To feel forgotten." She didn't respond, but her expression softened. The wall she'd been hiding behind began to show cracks. Hours passed. The storm outside grew fiercer, battering the landscape with wind and freezing rain. Orion patched a breach in the roof, then checked his supplies. Not much left. One day, maybe two, if rationed carefully. Kaliri needed more than he had. And now so did he. He turned toward her again, finding her sitting upright, gazing at the small fire orb that illuminated the room. Her mind reached for his once more, fainter now, but more focused. "They're searching. Still. I am. Hunted." That made his skin crawl. "Who's searching?" he asked. "The ones who tore apart the sky." She nodded. "The Natherian. Machines of war. They consume all life." Orion's hands clenched into fists. He had heard nothing about this. At least, not under that name. But the pieces fit. The disappearances. The silence from colonies. The strange artifacts left behind that buzzed with energy no one could identify. "Are they still here?" he asked. Kaliri shook her head. "Gone now. But they always return." Orion sat in silence, staring into the dim light of the orb. If she was right, and his gut told him she was, then this wasn't over. Not even close. But something else gnawed at him now. A realization. She hadn't just been starving. She had been hiding, not just from the cold or from hunger, but from extermination. She wasn't just an alien. She was a survivor of something humanity had barely understood. And now her survival was tied to his. "We can't stay here," he said finally. "Not for long. If those Natherian come back, this place won't protect us." She looked at him, unsure. "Where?" Orion stood, pulling out a faded, half-burned map from his side pouch. "There's an old transport hub 2 days north. Buried under ice, but rumor says there's still a working beacon there. If I can power it, maybe I can send a signal. Find others." Kaliri didn't move, but after a moment, she nodded once. And then, something unexpected. Her hand reached toward his chest, touching the old military patch sewn into his jacket, the faded insignia of Earth's now-defunct planetary corps. Her eyes met his again. "You fight, even now." "That is, human." Orion gave a bitter chuckle. "Yeah, that's human." She closed her eyes, then whispered, out loud, so faintly it was barely audible. "Then, I will fight too." Outside, the storm raged on, but in that broken shelter beneath the frozen sky, a promise had been made. Fragile, maybe, but real. And from it, something powerful was beginning to grow. The dawn broke slowly over the ruins, casting a pale blue glow across the snow-covered wasteland of Centaurus 7. The wind had calmed, but the cold remained sharp, biting at the exposed edges of skin and metal. The storm had passed, leaving a brittle silence behind it, like the world was waiting to breathe again. Orion packed his gear with quick, practiced motions. Every minute in the open was a gamble. The snow could shift, a storm could return, or worse, something could find them. Kaliri sat nearby, now wrapped in layers of salvaged thermal fabric he had stitched together for her the night before. She looked stronger today, still weak, but no longer on the edge of collapse. Her skin glowed faintly with warmth, her bioluminescent veins pulsing gently like a heartbeat. He helped her up, and they stepped outside together. The sky above was streaked with the last remnants of starlight, fading into the dawn. They had a long walk ahead, 2 days north, across ice fields, between shattered monoliths of steel and fallen orbital towers. The ancient transport hub, if it still existed, was buried beneath one of the oldest outposts on the continent. As they moved across the frozen terrain, the landscape told silent stories of destruction. Craters from atmospheric strikes, scorched metal remains, the shattered hulls of forgotten drones. Some had been human, others definitely not. Kaliri would pause occasionally, brushing her fingers over strange symbols carved into fallen debris, whispering names Orion didn't recognize. Names of her people, maybe. Of the dead. The first day passed with little incident. They rationed water, shared dried protein bark, and camped under the twisted frame of a collapsed sky bridge. Orion built a makeshift heat dome with old plasma shielding, while Kaliri sat in the dim light, eyes closed, reaching inward. He asked once what she was doing. Listening, came the whisper in his mind. For what? The stars. They still remember. He didn't know what to make of that. On the second day, the journey grew more difficult. They crossed the remains of a shattered plateau, where frost had turned the ground into glass. Kaliri slipped once, nearly falling over the edge, but Orion caught her in time, pulling her back with one arm. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the weight of the silence between them faded. She smiled, barely, but it was there. That afternoon, they found something neither of them expected. It was an old battlefield, half buried in snow and silence. Massive bipedal machines lay frozen in twisted poses, their limbs torn apart, scorched armor cracked by time. Both human and alien banners, tattered and colorless, hung from poles like forgotten prayers. Orion recognized the insignia of Earth's Defense Corps. This had been a last stand. In the center of it all was a broken statue, a monument, maybe. A human figure reaching skyward with one hand, the other shielding a child. Its face was missing, shattered, but the intention remained. Kaliri stepped toward it, kneeling beside a scorched helmet near the base. They fought. They fell. But not alone. Orion stood beside her, jaw clenched. We didn't win, but we didn't give up either. They rested for a time in the shadow of the statue. The quiet was different here, heavy, but not hopeless, reverent. When they finally reached the edge of the outpost, the sun was dipping behind the distant mountain ridges, casting long shadows across the skeletal remains of buildings. The entrance to the transport hub was half buried under layers of ice and collapsed stone. Orion scanned the ground. Looks like the main shafts caved in, but the service tunnel might still be intact. Kaliri followed him into the narrowing trench, the metal walls groaning with every step. Inside, their lights flickered across the rusted remnants of machinery and tangled wiring. The further they went, the more the air grew thick with frost and the scent of ozone, energy still lingering in the walls. Eventually, they reached a large chamber with a broken console at the center. It pulsed weakly with a red glow. Orion moved to it, wiping away a layer of frost from the screen. Most of the system was dead, but one interface still responded. Broadcast uplink, he said under his breath. Still operational. He began connecting wires, bypassing melted circuits, using scraps from his toolkit to force a signal through. Sparks danced from the panel, and Kaliri stepped back, shielding her eyes. The room trembled. Then, beep, a soft, rhythmic tone. The uplink was live. A signal, old but unmistakable, flashed on the screen. A beacon. Orion's heart leaped. It's working. Someone might hear this. Kaliri approached slowly. Her voice in his mind was different now, stronger. Will they come? He looked at her. If there's anyone left out there, they'll hear us. They'll come. She placed her hand on the console, and a second pulse of energy surged through it. Symbols, not human, flashed across the screen. The The signal doubled in strength. "You boosted it," he said, astonished. "I remembered," she whispered. "I was once a watcher of the stars." Before the darkness came, the air around them hummed, and for a moment, it felt like the whole planet was listening. Somewhere, far above, a satellite caught the signal and blinked to life for the first time in years. And far beyond that, something stirred. Orion didn't know if help would come tomorrow, or next week, or ever. But in that frozen chamber, beneath layers of ruin and loss, a spark had been reignited. Not just a signal, hope. And it had started with a choice: to share a meal with a starving stranger.